Oops, are you still there? Okay.
Yep, I'm here. I'm here.
I put it on record. Let's make sure it's actually doing that.
It says it's
Yeah.
doing it. So
Okay, good. So, anyway, so here we are, and I'm Judy Bello, and I'm on the administrative committee of the United National Anti-War Coalition, and I'm also a board member of an organization called Syria Solidarity Movement. And what we do is we try to keep we first of all we try to rehabilitate the reputation of Syria in this country from a lot of the false and negative press reports, and we also try to support. We do some charities inside of Syria. So and so you're Christopher Helali, and you are a Kurdish immigrant. Did you come here as a small child, or were you born here?
I was born here. My dad is from Iran. So we
Oh,
are
from
Kurds. We're
Iran.
Iranian Kurds.
I see.
And specifically, we are Lur, but we have a Kurdish. My grandfather's Kurdish, my grandmother's Lur. So we are, and Lur and Kurds are basically the same. And then my mom is from Greece. So
Oh,
both
wow,
parents
you
are
have a very
immigrants.
interesting background.
Yes,
Lots of interesting parents and grandparents.
that's right.
Yeah. So, so when we met in New York, you had told me that I had actually thought you were a Syrian Kurd, but I can see with your background that you're interested in politics and so on
Of
uh,
course.
in the Middle East. And here it's hard to know how to respond to politics. But so, how did you come to be interested in the war in Syria?
So I worked with refugees for about a year in Greece. I was living in Greece in 2016,
I see.
and I was there also in the summer of 2015. And I had met a lot of refugees who were coming over, specifically working with Kurdish refugees.
I see.
Um, and of course, I had known about the struggle in Kurdistan, about the PKK, about Abdullah Öcalan for a long time. But I hadn't been as interested because I was very much a Marxist Leninist. And since that time, the PKK had deviated from that. So I wasn't really as interested. But the more and more people were telling me about the stories, what's going on in northeast Syria, the more I felt compelled. At the time, I had turned to towards anarchism, and I said, "Oh, this seems interesting. It's a revolution. Let's go see what's going on."
Yeah.
So eventually, they told me, "Come, come, come," and eventually I made the decision to go and to join the Kurdish forces in northeast Syria.
So, was this around time when they were bombing the same city over and over again in northern Syria? I'm trying to think of the name of it. All I can think of is Ain al Arab, which is the Arab name. Um, but anyway,
Uh, you mean Kobani?
Kobani, yes.
Yeah, yeah. So it was after Kobane. So
Oh, okay.
I Kobane was basically, in the Kurdish mind, and for the Kurdish people, it's sort of a Stalingrad moment in
Uh,
northeast Syria. They considered it like that. So
right.
Daesh is
Citadel.
there, under siege. The Kurds are there, along with, of course, Arabs, Armenians,
Yeah.
Assyrians, everybody who's. It's a very a multicultural, multi-ethnic
Area.
society in Syria. So after Kobani, everybody was talking about the siege of Kobani, and I went to Syria right after Manbij was taken, and
Okay.
after the Turks had come in to Al Bab and that
Oh,
area.
all right.
So when I finally arrived in Syria, was a preparation for beginning the push towards Raqqa,
So,
and then of course, yeah,
I want to stop you for 1 minute,
sure,
which
sure.
is, so you refer to they. So who did you contact in Syria? Were there people you already knew there, or did you find a way to contact the Kurds there?
So of course in Europe, the Kurdish networks are all, if you are involved in any of the Kurdish networks that are pro PKK, they have links to all of the different arms of the
Oh,
PKK.
okay, that makes
So
sense.
Iraq, Syria, Iran, Turkey,
Uh-huh.
all of them have branches of the PKK. So they contacted people so I went first to Iraq. I
Right.
landed in Suleimania
Uh-huh.
and then went up to the mountains, to the Gare Mountains, which are at the border of Syria and Turkey and Iraq. So it's in that area where the mountains are, and the guerrillas were there of the PKK. We went to the camps,
Oh,
stayed a
interesting.
little while, and then eventually crossed over illegally into Syria.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and once we had gotten over, it was territory that was under the control at the time of the YPG, the PYD. And so we went there, and that's where we met with the cadro and all the people who were going to take us into training and then take us to the front.
So who was us? Were there other recruits there that came from
There
Europe?
Yeah, there were other internationals. Of course, as you know, the Syrian civil war had brought internationals from all over the world
Right.
for a variety
Yeah.
of different political persuasions.
Yes,
Of
yes.
course, the most of them came to be jihadists, to be like
Right.
Wahhabi Salafist jihadists
Yes.
against the Syrian Arab government,
Mm-hmm.
and against the legitimate government of Bashar al-Assad.
Right.
Um, Others, like myself, went with very radical left politics to fight against what we saw as, Wahhabi Salafist jihadists backed
Right.
by Saudi Arabia, by the US, by UAE, by Israel.
Yes.
So we wanted to go and wanted to fight. Not everybody was anti-regime in our groupings.
I see.
There were actually very many nationals who were pro-Hezbollah,
Mm.
pro-Iran, pro-Palestine, and pro-Syrian government. They wanted just to get in the fight against Daesh, so they figured that was the easiest route to go
That's
and join
interesting.
the Kurdish forces against Daesh in the north,
Mm.
while Hezbollah and the Syrian Arab government, and then the Russian forces and Iranian Quds forces were coming from the south.
Wow. Okay, that's interesting. I noticed though that the Kurds are a lot. A lot of the Kurds they were still receiving up until the United States adopted them. They were receiving their weapons and provisions still from the Syrian government.
So you're right. Even a lot of Kurds there are not against the government of Bashar al-Assad or the
Right.
central government in Damascus. In fact, you know uh, the government controlled areas of Kamishlo,
Yes.
Kamishli. It controlled areas of Hasakeh. It controlled areas all throughout the northeast Syrian parts, like military bases, airports, were still
Right.
controlled by, in certain neighborhoods, were still controlled by pro-regime forces.
I see.
And so we interacted with them. We'd say hello, it'd be back and forth. Sometimes there was fighting between
Mhm.
Kurdish forces and the Syrian government forces, but most of the time it was very peaceful. There was aid going back and forth. There was open, lines of communication and people going back and forth in different neighborhoods.
Oh, that's
Um,
interesting.
and I think that the Kurds, being a minority in Syria, recognized that um, Free Syrian Army were also jihadists as well.
Yes.
you know
Okay.
so people would say to me, oh, we'd rather have Assad in power than have some Sunni extremists in power who are going to cleanse Kurds, Armenians, Assyrians,
Right.
all these different Druze,
Yeah.
of course Alevi,
Mm.
gonna clear them all out. So they
Mhm.
didn't want that, so many of them remained pro-regime that we met.
Great. Great. So then what happened when you got there? So you got through your training. I'll let you go back to your timeline now. You got through your training and you went into Syria, or you went into Syria and you met the people who were going to train you. That's right.
Right. So we
So,
met the people who were going to train us, and of course we had most of the time there was spent in ideological training, learning about Abdullah Öcalan, learning about the PKK's history,
mm,
learning about the new synthesis, the new ideology, which was sort of this democratic confederalism, this
mhm,
idea that Northeast Syria, which is called Rojava, like it can
mhm.
somehow be an autonomous area inside the Syrian state, and it can have some sort of autonomy and be able to do this kind of anarchist type experiment and in
I
direct
see.
democracy. Um, we learned the genealogy, which is sort of a Kurdish indigenous feminism, and we learned a lot of the ideological components of the party and of the quote unquote revolution. And then we had a week of weapons trainings, learning about tactics, learning about how we would be fighting
Yeah.
against Daesh and against any sort of jihadist forces that we would be
Yeah.
fighting against. Um, and so after a month, basically month and a half, we eventually left our training, and then we went to our various bases. So of course, I joined the International Freedom Battalion, which was a collection of Turkish and Kurdish communist parties.
Mm-hmm.
So TKP, which is the Turkish Communist Party Marxist-Leninists, they're the largest Maoist group. The Maoist Communist Party, MLKP, the Marxist-Leninist Communist Party, which are Hojes, they follow the Albanian line. DKP, which was the Revolutionary Communist Party, which were Marxist-Leninists. And then my formation that I was involved in was an anarchist formation, and there were two anarchist formations. One, both of them kind of based in Greece, that had brought over anarchists as well. But the main of the majority of the body were communists, and
Oh,
so we
interesting.
all joined up together, and we all had our own bases. Each party had their own bases. They trained, and then we all would collectively be on the front line together fighting. Now, many of those parties are considered terrorists by the United States, by NATO, because they had historically attacked U.S. military personnel, or U.S. interests, NATO interests in Turkey itself, because
Right.
they're at war with the Turkish government.
Right. Right.
So it was a very bizarre situation that all of a sudden these parties are terrorists in Turkey, but now they're sort of accepted in northeast Syria because they're fighting against Daesh, and the coalition is there. So the US
Yeah.
is there, the NATO is there, everybody's there. So it was a very sort of schizophrenic situation that
Yeah.
somehow, if you'd crossed the border, you were now a terrorist and they were still attacking you. You came over to northeast Syria, you were somehow a freedom fighter, and you're
Yeah.
fighting against ISIS and all this kind of stuff. So it required some level of cognitive dissonance to be able to understand how we could be at war with U.S. NATO imperialism, and then at the same time somehow allied in the big structure with U.S. NATO imperialism in the fight in Syria against Daesh, who they were supporting. So
Right.
it was kind of crazy. It was a
That is
crazy
crazy.
situation.
Very crazy. So, did you feel like endangered by all this craziness, or did you just kind of go with it?
So I was really committed to fighting against Daesh, who I just heinous crimes committed by them against the
Yeah.
Syrian people, against all the minorities. We had been in firefights with them on our campaign to Raqqa. It wasn't until I was a few weeks on the front line in Raqqa that I realized that when the last push towards the city came, and then finally the city advancement,
Right. Right.
we saw military warplanes, A-10s, drones. We saw all of this heavy military buildup, both on the ground and in the air.
Yes.
And then it was in the nighttime we saw white phosphorus being used in Raqqa.
Really.
And so I felt very upset because, for example, I've been for Palestinian liberation since I was in the womb. My family very pro-Palestine. So
Yeah.
all of a sudden, here I am. I protest against Israel using white phosphorus against Palestinians, and
Yeah.
now somehow I am in the situation where I'm with a so-called revolutionary force in Syria, and the same enemy is using white phosphorus against innocent people as well. Because Raqqa
Right.
was not only Daesh, there were also innocent Syrians as well caught up
Many.
in the midst of
Many.
the civil war.
Yes.
So I got really upset, and there was long conversations, denouncements. Sort of people felt very torn and conflicted about
Right.
the situation, and I felt that Raqqa, the campaign in Raqqa, was way over the top in terms
Mm.
of military force. It was like total warfare. It reminded me of World War II, just a complete decimation of a city,
Yes.
you know.
Yes. I've seen it.
And so for me, having been through the streets and having seen it, um, I was disillusioned. I said, I don't want to be a part of this. This isn't what I
Yeah.
signed up for. I'm committed anti-imperialist. I'm committed towards the people,
Yeah, of
not
course.
towards, these big interests who don't give a shit about the people and the
Yeah.
working
Yeah.
class, nothing like that. They just want and now we know for the oil, not so much
Yeah.
that the US needs the oil, but to not have the Syrian government have the oil, or
Right.
the
Right.
Russian forces have the oil, or Iranian forces have the oil, who are there fighting jihadists.
Yes.
But instead, the U.S. had its own interests. And then, of course, the U.S. military presence started building up. You'd see U.S. military, you'd see the helicopters, you'd see a lot of armored personnel carriers going. And then I
Yeah.
felt this is going to be a little enclave for the U.S. It's sort of
Right.
it's becoming sort of a principality of the U.S.
Right.
And I didn't want to be a part of that. I said no, no. I mean, I'm against U.S. imperialism. And
Yeah.
so, it wasn't until I really spent more time in the rear, we went into the cities, I saw the regime areas, and I
Uh-huh.
felt that, uh, Bashar al-Assad is a legitimate leader of Syria, and the Syrian people deserve to have a peace and not have all of these outside actors coming in and wreaking havoc. Uninvited outside actors, because Russia has been invited by the
Right.
legitimate Syrian government. Iran has been invited by the legitimate Syrian government. Hezbollah has been invited. But the US, NATO, Turkey, nobody else was invited. The Kurds who were in Syria, the Syrian Kurds, were
Right.
fighting, but then other Kurds came. It just became such a smorgasbord of all these outside interests, outside actors. Everybody's coming in to get
Yeah.
involved, and I felt that it wasn't appropriate. It was wrong. It was wrong at this point. It was. I feel that fighting against Daesh was good for me, because
Right.
Daesh was an evil force, evil against the Syrian people, evil against the minorities. It
Mhm.
was just, but it was evil created by the same people who were supposedly allied with the
Were you
Kurdish forces.
were you aware at all? Like I've seen videos, and it's pretty clear the United States rescued the remnants of Daesh from Raqqa.
Oh, I'm sure. I'm sure. And we also know, for example, I never saw that personally, but all of the people, all of the Daesh fighters that we captured, we had to turn over to Kurdish security forces. Who knows where they went? I never saw where they went.
Yeah. Yeah.
We turned over all the fighters in the battles that I was a part of. I don't know. They just went away in a motorcycle, on the back of a motorcycle. I never saw them again.
Oh, really? That's interesting.
Yeah,
On
because
the
that's how
back
they
of a
would take people back
motorcycle.
and forth, motorcycles in the front
That's
line. So
not
who
very.
knows? I have no idea. Also, Daesh was always on the border. They shared a border with Israel. Israel helped them.
Right.
Daesh never attacked Israel.
No, it's true. It's
You
true.
know,
They were in the Golan. Yeah, they were
that's
getting
right. They were
Golan.
in the Golan. For me, I quickly realized that, while this was a struggle for the Syrian people, it was being hijacked by all of these imperial interests.
Right.
Everybody
Right.
wanted a piece of Syria. They wanted to turn Syria into a Yugoslavia.
Yeah, yeah, they did actually, and that's a very interesting way to look at it because Yugoslavia, they used economics to smash it as well as the war.
Of
They
course.
they basically pitted them against each other economically so that they couldn't survive as one country.
You're absolutely right. And of course, if there were communists in northeast Syria who were aligned with the Syrian regime, but they weren't allowed to express it because the Kurds had now control over the northeast. And
I see.
so and so there were a lot of, it wasn't that there was a unified sort of popular mobilization in the north for the Kurdish forces. There were also factions within that. People
Right.
who didn't want the US NATO there, people who did want the US NATO there. For example, I remember in one firefight, the U.S. Warplane bombed a Daesh position in front of us, and one of the Kurds said, "Oh, Heval Trump." I said, "What the fuck, Heval Trump? He's our enemy." But you see, like people, it was just ideologically everywhere.
Yes.
This conflict was everywhere.
Well, and the Kurds, at least the Iraqi Kurds, when I was in Sulaymaniyah, this was 2009, and they were still big fans of George Bush
Absolutely.
because he got Saddam Hussein to actually I thought Clinton did it. They pushed, the elder Bush, I guess. They pushed Iraq back out of the Iraqi Kurdistan when they were killing people and torturing them and gassing people. And so they really looked up to him. And that's part of the problem is, everybody has their little lens. And
Right.
see like what's in the little area that they can actually see. And it's very hard in such a complicated situation for people in general to see the whole picture.
Of course, you're absolutely right. There might be, for me, no government is perfect. There might be legitimate concerns about, the Syrian government, like any other government that we support and admire,
Of course.
But it doesn't mean that you can go overthrow them and all of a sudden start bombing this and doing that and, declaring independence and things. No, no. There are mechanisms and ways for that to be done by the society. And
Yeah.
I just felt that this was getting way over the top. And
Yeah.
the fact that the U.S. started setting up military bases, they really for me, it was just unacceptable.
Yeah.
As an
I can see that.
anti-imperialist, it was unacceptable. And so that's why I eventually left. And I, didn't want to go back and not to be involved anymore in
Mhm.
the conflict, because this Syria should have its territorial integrity. It should be
Mhm.
unified, and the Syrian people now should focus on rebuilding their country, on ending the illegal sanctions against their country,
Right.
and on allowing all the foreign aid from China, Russia, Cuba, whoever is in solidarity with the Syrian people and the Syrian government to help rebuild that country.
Yes. Well, hooray. I totally agree with everything you say. And I'm very impressed by your boldness and bravery in going out to find all this out for yourself.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's for when I was learning and over time understanding the Middle East as a child.
Yeah.
Hafiz al-Assad was an extremely important figure, pro-Soviet.
Yeah.
Definitely an important figure in the Middle East, and who supported Abdullah Öcalan, the head of the PKK, to establish a headquarters in
Mhm.
Damascus. Hafiz al-Assad.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you look, there are photographs of Abdullah Öcalan, the head of the PKK, with a photograph of Assad behind him. So I
Hmm.
think that we should be indebted to the Assad family and to the regime for all that they provided for the Kurds in their struggle against, for example, Turkey, against
Hmm.
NATO imperialism in the north, and
Yeah.
how the Turkish government has done gross abuses against the Kurds.
Yes, they
Um,
have.
and so Syria supported that. And it wasn't until Turkey threatened Syria with invasion that Hafez al-Assad has had to have Abdullah Öcalan leave Damascus. And eventually he was captured by the U.S. with the support of Mossad and MIT, the Turkish intelligence.
Hmm.
So I think that the more I realized the conflict and I talked to people on the ground, the more I realized that, for example, there was a love of the Syrian, there was a love of the Syrian government and a Syrian pride. For example, it was the Syrian Arab Republic sent a man to space with the Soviet Union. You know,
Yeah.
this was a source of pride for villagers I met.
Oh, yeah.
Villagers. When I asked them, I said, "What do you think about the Syrian government and of Bashar al-Assad?" And they said, "Well, we went to space. This little country that's now being torn apart by all of these enemies went to space, had a man in space. And that
Yeah.
was that famous broadcast of this from space with Hafiz al-Assad in the presidential office. So I think that my journey has led me to believe that there's a lot of propaganda against the Syrian Arab Republic,
Mm.
against the legitimate Syrian government of Bashar al-Assad. And since Bashar al-Assad and the Syrian people are pro-Palestinian, they love Iran, they love Hezbollah, they love Russia, they want all of the people who support them to fight against all of these jihadist forces. That makes them the pariah of US and EU and NATO imperialism, because
Yes.
that's not their interest. They don't want somebody who's going to criticize Israel They don't want somebody who's going to not have their oil go to their coffers and their pockets. Where was Daesh's oil going?
Yeah.
Who was he
Well,
selling
and
to?
of course, well, I mean, Daesh was selling it through Turkey.
That's right. That's right. A NATO ally. So for me, it's it just it further solidified the fact that the mass media here, the misinformation, all of it was done again for a regime change war that was concocted in Washington and in Riyadh,
Right.
or in Tel Aviv. So I think that it needs to be said openly that the Kurds have a place in Syria, Armenians have a place in Syria, Assyrians, Druze, Sunni, Shia, Alawite, whoever they are, Jews, everybody has a place in the Syrian Arab Republic, but Syria should be one, should be
Yes.
unified, and the Syrian people should decide their destiny. Not the US, not Saudi Arabia, not the UAE, not Israel. Israel, for example, we now know Israel is annexing the Golan Heights. They want to make Trump Heights up there in
Oh
honor
no.
of Donald Trump
Trump,
for
right.
recognizing the Golan Heights belong to Israel and not to Syria. This is absurd. This is absurd. It only shows the truth behind this entire conflict, which was to dismember and tear apart Syria, because Syria remained a strong, independent Arab republic.
That's true.
All around them, everybody was, US and NATO imperialism has taken apart Muammar Gaddafi's Libya, even after he did their bidding, tore them apart. Hillary Clinton laughing. We came, we saw he died. This kind of thing. It's horrible, horrible stuff. They tore apart Iraq. They tore apart, they've been tearing apart Iran now. They want to tear apart Iran. They tore apart Afghanistan. They tore apart Yemen. How many other places? Of course, Syria was on the hit list from the beginning. Even General Wesley Clark said Syria after 9/11 was on the hit list.
Yes.
So that's the truth. That's the truth on the ground that I realized and I saw. Why are all these US forces here? Yeah, of course. That's what they wanted. They were not interested in the Kurdish people. The US has never cared about the Kurdish people. Never. What would they care about? They care about their interests because in northern Iraq, in Iraqi Kurdistan, what do they have? Oil. Who's there? All the big oil companies. If they didn't have oil, you think the US would be there? I don't think so. I don't think they would have cared.
And
But
the U.S. has a very sneaky presence in northern Iraq. But
absolutely,
they do not, at least when I was there 10 years ago, they don't admit really that they have a strong presence there.
they do.
And they, in fact, I got sick while I was there, and they tried to contact my nephew, bless his heart, from here. He's a politician here. He tried to contact the embassy in Iraq, and they said there's no embassy outside of Baghdad. So,
Uh,
he was like, but how is that going to help? But at any rate, so it was very strange because he got a total runaround as if they'd never heard of this place, basically. You know,
right,
like we like to talk about an American who's legally in Sulaymaniyah, and
right.
so nothing, nothing at all. And they're very underhanded in their foreign policy.
Absolutely, absolutely. So me going and seeing it and living it and struggling there, I realized a deep love for the Syrian people. A people very proud, very tough, resilient in the face of all of this war and conflict.
Yeah.
And I realized how horrible it was what the jihadists did to the Syrian people.
Mm-hmm.
Because the people who suffered most were the Syrian people. It wasn't US citizens, it wasn't French citizens or German citizens or Turkish citizens. It was Syrian people who suffered.
That's right.
And so, leaving and coming home and just dealing with my memories and with all of the pain and everything, the trauma of what I lived through, I realized that, we should be defending the right of the Syrian people. We should be fighting for the Syrian people's, independence from all of this aggression. Their ability to move on. And still today, we haven't been able to. The U.S. is still there. Everybody, all the imperialist powers are still there trying to tear apart Syria, and for example, speaking of, of what I think was underlying this, in northeast Syria, on one of my trips, in the area of Dahuk, which is towards the Turkish border in the northeast, we went to a facility, and that facility had been taken over by the YPG. And when I went there, I realized, because I had lived in China for 2 years, I have a master's degree in Marxist philosophy from China. I had realized that there was Chinese writing, there was Chinese characters, and I said, "Oh my gosh, it was Sinopec." And from what I've learned, China had interest in the oil, in helping to develop and helping the Syrian government develop and being a part of the process of extraction of oil in the northeast. There we were, sitting in a Chinese government-run facility, oil company, and who is it controlled now by? The Kurds. Who was above them? The U.S. And I said, aha, China trying to help the Syrian government, Russia, all these countries. The U.S. is there to break that. They don't want the global South and all of these countries to challenge U.S. hegemony.
Right. Well, it's interesting about China because in Libya, one of the things that was happening right before the U.S. And NATO started that war against Gaddafi, well, regime change, where he basically, again, though, killing civilians, killing ordinary people.
Of course.
But right before that, China was like doing most of the oil development in Libya, which has not only a lot of oil, but a really high quality of oil.
Right.
So the United States basically had been cut out there.
Right, exactly.
And they, I'm sure, did not like that a bit. So that was time to do something about it.
That's right.
There's a lot of this kind of thing. And I noticed too, you talked about the Turkey being a problem for the Kurds in Syria, but the Iraqi Kurds, right where you're talking about, by Dahuk and right along the border in those mountains that you went through,
right?
They're routinely bombed by the Turkish army.
Absolutely, you're absolutely right.
And it actually destroys good farmland, and it destroys the water supply coming out of the mountains. And that's one of the things I learned when I was there, that there was an Iranian, I met a woman whose husband was an Iranian engineer, an agricultural engineer, and they were trying to figure out how to restore the soil in some of these areas that had been so heavily bombed on the borders.
Right.
So
actually, it wasn't Dahuk was the other area. Derek was the place in Syria. Derek was
that's what Dahuk is in Iraq.
In Iraq. No, Derek was it was above it was Derek, and it was right above trying to remember the name now. Where were we? Where was our base? It'll come to me. So many names to remember of all the places I was at.
No, so you speak Chinese?
Dian, a little bit, yes.
Arabic?
Sure.
Or just Kurdish? Speak Kurdish? Is that how you communicate with the?
We spoke, because we had taken Kurdish lessons, so I knew a fair, a decent amount of Kurdish to get by every day.
Oh, that's good. So you didn't learn that from your dad, though. You learned that.
No. My dad speaks Persian, speaks Farsi.
He speaks Farsi.
Yeah.
Actually,
because of course, under the Shah of Iran, the Shah, the educational apparatus of the state at that time was that all minorities should speak Persian.
Right.
So a lot of minorities who were educated, in Iran were taught in Persian, and their languages, in the Shah's time were not were spoken outside of the educational facilities. But already Persian had become sort of the lingua franca of all of the ethnic groups. To today, of course, everybody speaks Persian.
Here, everybody speaks English, except the people who just got here. You know, they
Exactly.
still, but you can tell how long someone's been here, whether they learned any English.
Exactly,
But
exactly.
that's the same kind of thing. Yeah, I think it's so interesting. So are you planning on going back to the Middle East at any point?
I would love to go back to Syria, but I would like to go through Damascus. I'd like to see other parts of Syria. I'd like to really go on a delegation in solidarity with the Syrian people.
Well,
I'd like to learn more about Syria. I'd like to learn more about the Syrian people. And I'd really like to give my thanks to the Syrian government for all that they've done to combat all of the enemies that have come to harm them and destroy them. And for me, my time there really opened a window into what the U.S. does abroad.
yeah, I think it's hard to go to these places, even for me, and I wasn't really in the war zone, to not, once you're there, it's really very clear.
Oh, it's evident. It's right. It's right there. It's visceral in front of you. And now we're seeing it on U.S. streets. Whatever the U.S. does abroad, they do in our own streets. You see this after
Uh,
the killing, the brutal killing and horrific killing of George Floyd. All of the justified and righteous protesters going out there and demanding defunding the police, community
right.
control of the police. And you see what happens. The response is a militarized police force. That militarized police force is the same militarized police force that goes and tries to control all of the other countries all over the world.
That's so true. And that is actually so, that is one of the strong points that I think UNAC really likes to focus on in our organization. Anti-imperialism and understanding that what's happening here and what's happening in the colonized countries or the countries that we're making war on, it's all one fabric. It's all one
Absolutely.
fabric because there's an elite, a very, very small number of very powerful people who really don't care at all about the welfare of the masses of the people. And thinking of being a Marxist, so I don't know, have you read Michael Hudson on economics?
I
He
have. I've read some of Michael Hudson. Yes.
Yes, he's really good, and he's an anarchist in his way, and he loves to tear apart the capitalist system.
Of
He does
course.
it so well.
And
So,
of course, Richard Wolff,
and Richard Wolff is
excellent.
wonderful. He's like so fatherly. He comes up with these great ideas, and
Absolutely.
hopefully we'll get more people doing it. So, is your farm? Do you and your partner own it, or is it a communal farm, or is it a
So
family
my
farm?
my partner and her family own it, but we're four generations living here.
Oh,
Uh,
wow. Sure.
yeah, yeah. Her grandmother lives here, who's 95, and we have our 14th month old, 15th month old now, who's here. So it's amazing. It's amazing to
Oh,
have the young and the old together on one farm, everybody together all the time. It's really wonderful.
well, it sounds really great. Well, I'm
It
so
is. It
happy I
is.
was able to talk to you. Is there anything you would like to add to our conversation before I let you
There's,
get back?
I'm thinking, what would be nice is if you transcribe this, type it up, and then I can add in some details that I might be forgetting, and we can add to that. It can be an ongoing, sort of document, so that way when you publish it, it can be meeting and have a lot of interesting things there for people.
Okay, well, I'll try to do that. I'm going to initially, I'm just going to share the video with some people of our
Okay.
discussion conversation. And but I think I really enjoyed talking to you tonight, and maybe there'll be some other people who want to hear from you too. So
Absolutely, absolutely.
we'll proceed with that, and we'll see how easy it is to transcribe. So
Absolutely. And I'm very honored that our organization, of which I'm chair, the Red Banner Anti-Imperialist Collective, is a member of UNAC now, and
yeah,
that
great.
we have the opportunity to be a part of UNAC and to continue the anti-war, anti-imperialist line, and to continue to combat U.S. NATO imperialism and aggression all over the world against all of the nations that are just seeking their self-determination and their independence from this hegemonic power that we live in.
Right. Well, that's great. Thanks a lot, Chris.
Thank you so much. Take care.
You too. Good
Uh,
night.
good night. Bye bye.
Bye.